What effect will the midterm elections have on the debt ceiling when it comes due after the first of the year? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. This is this week's Libertarian Angle that you all know brings you the principled and compromising case for the libertarian philosophy, mostly within the context of the burning issues of the day. I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, professor of economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
Good to be with you and our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, thanks for tuning in. Thanks for your great support. You'll be receiving our end-of-year fundraising letter if you haven't already. We've already sent it out online. I hope you'll give it your consideration and send us your generous support. Y'all have kept us going for 33 years, and we definitely need your help for the coming year. As you know, we couldn't do it without those of you that help us out in a bigger way, and it's through your help that we're able to do shows like this and our online conference, which I hope you're enjoying, on ending inflation and the Fed. It continues this Monday night with Ron Paul, or as he's known in the libertarian movement, the great Ron Paul. And I think you're going to be in for a real treat because he's the guy that started the whole "in the Fed" mantra that became so popular all across America, both on the left and the right, and of course within the libertarian movement as well. So, Richard, okay, the midterms are over. The Republicans seem to be licking their wounds. What was supposed to be the great red wave turned out to be the tiny red ripple. And old Biden's over there taking a victory lap. And we haven't heard much from Trump, but I did read that they were asking him to stay away from Georgia and the runoff election there. So he's pretty much down in the dumps, I'm sure. But there's humor that comes out of these things sometimes, and one of the humorous aspects was an article that I read in the New York Times analyzing the election results, and it speculated over the possibility that Republicans could still take control of both houses of Congress. The jury's still out. Looks like they're going to take control in the House, but apparently for some reason they still can't call it for sure. And they still could conceivably take control in the Senate, depending on the outcome of the votes, I think, in Nevada, and Georgia, and Arizona. So the article was saying that if the Republicans take over, we can really be fairly certain that there's going to be a huge battle over the debt ceiling. And when I read that, I mean, it was hard for me to not guffaw in laughter over this. The battle over the debt ceiling. Oh, yeah, also, and whether the government will be shut down. So, of course, the idea is that if those Republicans get into power, oh, they're going to shut down the government to enforce the debt ceiling. How can intelligent people really believe this nonsense? The Republicans are not about to shut down the government and enforce the debt ceiling. Oh, they might make a little huff about it like they always do, but they always cave. They always have caved. They will always cave. It's the nature of the Republican Party to cave with respect to out of control debt. And we see this time and time again. I find it interesting. I'm not sure it's a coincidence, but maybe it is, that they timed the amount of the additional debt from the time the last debt ceiling was reached. They added on more authority to incur more debt. And I find it interesting that it comes due after the midterm elections. Maybe it's just a coincidence, but from what I can tell, the new debt ceiling is set to be reached around January, maybe February. We've already got $31 trillion in debt. I think they've got some leeway here for, I don't know, a few more hundreds of thousands of dollars. I don't know what the amount is, but I read that somewhere they're estimating that around the first part of the year the new debt ceiling is going to be reached. And I think it's important to talk about it now, Richard. I mean, we know how much debt this government is incurring on a daily basis. You can go to a great website called usdebtclock.org, and it shows exactly how much debt is being added on to the national debt. And keep in mind that this is just straight liabilities, contractual liabilities on the debt. It doesn't take into account the so-called entitlements, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. Now, those are not recorded there because they're not strictly liabilities. They're just welfare state programs. But still, government's got to fund them. And every time there's a debt ceiling debate, and I've pointed this out every time in the 33 years that we've been here at FFF, every time it's reached, I say, okay, they're bringing up all these chicken little arguments. Oh, the world will fall in if the debt ceiling is enforced. The sky's going to fall in, and everything's going to go to hell in a handbasket. And of course, it works. So they increase the debt ceiling, but as soon as the debt ceiling vote is taken and it's approved and they're celebrating, nobody for the next 3 or 4 years calls for a reduction in federal spending. It's like, oh, well, yep, we did it again. We got another debt ceiling increase. Don't worry about it. And then when the next debt ceiling comes up 3 or 4 years down the line, same old thing. Oh, if we don't raise the debt ceiling, the sky's going to fall in and all this. And then they get their little victory, but they never say, well, we better prepare because in anticipation of the next debt ceiling, maybe they won't raise it. We need to slash spending here so that expenditures equal revenues. They never do that because they know that the chicken little arguments are going to be swaying people again. So this notion that if the Republicans take control, that they're going to do something about this is absolutely ludicrous. There's absolutely no difference between the Republicans and the Democrats when it comes to out of control spending and out of control debt, and of course the inflation that comes with it. What do you think, Richard?
Well, currently the debt is approximately $31.2 trillion. And as I understand, the current debt limit obligates the U.S. government not to go beyond $3.4 trillion. So they're about $200 billion away, $300 billion away between now and when that ceiling would be hit. Now, as has happened each time that these debt crises have arisen, debt ceiling crises has arisen, the Treasury plays accounting gimmicks. They transfer funds between these different accounts that they have. There are certain surpluses for pension funds that they temporarily have a huge inflow, and they shift that over. So they have a bunch of accounting gimmicks, which I understand that if a private company were to do this to cover over its financial deficiencies, the executive officers would potentially be thrown into jail. But the U.S. government gets away with this. So probably they could extend this February or March, depending upon the usual bag of tricks that they have used in the past when these debt ceiling deadlines have been approaching. But the biggest bugaboo, Jacob, the biggest bugaboo is if we don't raise the debt limit, the U.S. government will not be able to meet its financial responsibilities to its creditors. Oh, this is a serious matter. Why America might default, miss interest payments on the outstanding debt. Why we'd be like some banana republic in South America. It would be the end of America, and the world economy, the financial markets would shake. Well, the fact is that the United States government has more than enough money to meet any of its minimal interest payments on the existing debt, regardless of whether the debt limit is raised or not. Why do I say that? Let's just use the fiscal year 2021 that has just ended for the United States government. Uncle Sam operates on a fiscal year not of the calendar year, but of October 1 through September 30th. And the Congressional Budget Office recently released their monthly budgetary report or review, and did a summary of the fiscal year that ended recently. And in Uncle Sam's fiscal year 2022, the U.S. government took in approximately $4.9 trillion in taxes, personal income tax, salary withholding of various sorts for entitlements and so on, and et cetera, corporate business taxes, other sources, approximately $4.9 trillion. Now, the government also in 2022 spent over $6 trillion. So that's why they had to borrow so much money, this year's budget deficit. But the fact is that what would be the interest payment that the government would have to pay? Well, for the entire year, fiscal year 2022, net interest payments owed by the federal government came to $534 billion. $534 billion. Now, interest charges are likely to go up as the federal government rolls over existing debt. They never pay it off, and then would want to borrow new debt. But it's certainly out of revenues of $4.9 trillion. We're talking about almost $5 trillion of tax revenues. The government easily can afford to pay about $550 billion in interest payments for the whole coming year. Now, of course, what that would entail, so as not to threaten the international financial standing of the federal government, it means that domestic programs would have to be reduced. In fact, if you don't exceed the debt ceiling, the U.S. government immediately has to operate within a balanced budget. It can only spend what it takes in taxes. It doesn't have the authority to borrow anymore. So what would be required at a minimum would be for the federal government to take in tax revenues, pay around probably $550 billion of interest payments for this coming year, and then make cuts on the domestic side. And even if they get nervous about what about the entitlements? It's statutory. Well, there's practically $2 trillion of what are called discretionary spendings. Discretionary means that they're not built into automatic expenditures in the law. Like the federal government is expected to pay everybody their Social Security check every month, meet Medicare, Medicaid payments every month that become due. They could cut the military budget. The federal defense budget for 2022 was approximately $750 billion. You're going to tell me you can't shave off a few hundred billion, a couple of $300 billion of that? I'm not even talking about our kind of limited government principles. I'm talking pragmatically, Jacob. Could they manage their finances, right? Which is what matters to these people and other people in the pragmatic real world. Yes, of course. And you could cut the Department of Education. The Department of Education ate up about $500 billion last year. Okay, so they can shave the spending out of these programs, what are called the discretionary spending, to easily meet all of its debt, interest debt payments, and stay within what it takes in taxes. But they would have to cut. And cutting is not what any politician wants to do. Why, Jacob? What is it that politicians want? To be elected to office and reelected to office. And you do so by promising various special interest groups, which combined as a coalition, they're hoping will put them in office, by giving them what? Other people's money. That's what this is all about. Using the government as the conduit for the transfer of other people's money from Group A to Group B. And what they don't want to have to do is to go before their constituents and say, guess what? I'm going to take some of the food out of the government trough that you've been eating at. I'm not even talking about taking it away from you. I don't want you to get nervous now. Oh no, how can you do without your government money? But we're just putting you on a diet, right? You know, like if you're overweight, you eat smaller portions in the meals, you eat a little something differently. You get out and exercise, which means being responsible for yourself rather than on the government. And everything will be fine, but they don't want to tell people, their constituents, you have to go onto a diet to tighten your belt. And that's why it becomes the game that you're talking about.
Well, let me just tell you, there's one big problem with your analysis. And we have to keep giving those weaponry and monies to that regime in Ukraine, Richard. I mean, how could we jeopardize that by enforcing the debt ceiling? What a terrible thing that would be. Oh, you're absolutely right, Richard. I mean, the way I look at it is that when you've got a contract, that has legal validity to it, and that if you have to choose between a contract and a welfare program, there's no law that says that welfare has to be continued. Nobody has a right to welfare, and so if they have to default on their Social Security or Medicare or food stamps or public housing or other welfare program, that's not a breach of contract. Now, I know there's people saying, oh, a promise has been made. There's never been a promise made. It's a straight welfare state program. They can be brought into existence. It can go out of existence. It can be reduced. Bonds are a different question. There you've got a written promise to pay, and people have loaned their money. And so if you're given a choice, I say you got to honor the contract. So your analysis is very interesting on the financial end, because that's what we always hear. Oh, this necessarily means a default. And the whole financial world, the banking industries, everybody's going to go into a free fall if they default. Well, under your analysis, that isn't the case at all.
No.
They just have to cut elsewhere. And I'm glad you mentioned the military. But you see, Richard, here's the problem, is that for all these people that are on the dole, that is the welfare warfare state dole, they fight viciously for their money. I mean, they don't want to reduce anything. Oh, yeah, they'll support reductions in other people's dole, but not their dole. I mean, you talk to most seniors, man, I put it in, I have a right to get it back. And they're not going to agree to a reduction in their dole. Medicare recipients, same thing. Seniors are not going to let go of this nice little dole, no matter how much of a mess it creates in the healthcare industry. And the military? Oh, are you kidding me? The national security establishment controls Congress. They even gave them more money than they were asking for in order to curry favor with them. And if anybody suggests that the military budget should be reduced, what they do is they go out and they start reducing in the military bases that everybody's dependent on, and everybody freaks out and says, oh no, we're going to die if the base is reduced or closed here. And so that's not going to go anywhere. So what I'm really getting the feeling, Richard, is that they may really be trapped. I mean, I know that libertarians have been predicting for a long time that this whole system of the welfare warfare state's not going to end well. People have got their survival stuff all ready to go and everything. Well, it's impossible to know, the timing of a system that is really headed toward a really bad ending. But you can look at it logically, though, and say, well, I may not be able to predict the timing, but if you keep on this track, you're going to end up in a really bad collision here. And I get the feeling that we may finally be getting to that point. I think they might be trapped here. The Fed's been raising these interest rates in a fairly monumental way. I don't think they can keep that up. I think at the first sign of deep trouble, I mean, you've got, okay, the housing market's gotten a little bit soft, but from what I can tell, prices are still stabilized. And there's no financial stresses like there was in 2008, with financial institutions threatening to go under, and they had to go bail them out, and everybody was freaking out and saying, oh my gosh, we're in a deep crisis. I don't see any of that yet. And if it starts to happen, the Fed's going to crater immediately, and they're going to start repumping that money. And I think that's more likely to happen. That you've got this monumental debt. Nobody's talking about slashing spending. All they're talking about is raising the debt ceiling again so that a few more trillions of dollars can be added onto it. You've got out of control price increases, which they call inflation, price inflation. They're blaming it on big business, big oil, the petroleum industry, is like they always do, the gasoline station owners, the rapacious retail businesses, when we all know as libertarians that there's one cause of this, and that's the Federal Reserve. So when you put all this thing together, especially in a historical context, they want to adopt the welfare warfare state in the 30s and the 50s. They bring into existence the income tax, the 16th Amendment, the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve, the IRS's job is to collect massive amounts of taxes to fund this new welfare warfare state system. But immediately, or almost immediately, and decade after decade, their expenditures far exceed their tax revenues. That's where the Fed comes in. They're borrowing the money, but they know that the Fed will print the money to pay it off. And over these decades, you can see the monetary unit being debased and debased and debased, where they drove gold out of existence, they drove silver out of existence, and you've got this fiat currency. And I think they might be trapped in a really bad situation here where I don't know how it's going to end, but I keep thinking that this time around, this may be the big one that really is going to end very badly one way or another.
I'm always reluctant to claim that I have a crystal ball. And I think that it's quite likely that they will attempt to kick the can down the road further. And with all the hemming and hawing, as you started off in the comments, that the Republicans always end up caving in, that they'll end up reaching some type of a deal in which the Republicans can claim a victory over the president, and the president can claim that even though he doesn't control Congress anymore, he made the Republicans eat some of the stuff they don't like to, and they'll just end up raising it. But the thing to emphasize is that at a minimum, the Congress would have to approve an increase in the national debt of at least another $1.5 to $2 trillion. The reason being is that the Congressional Budget Office, based upon existing tax laws and expected revenue inflows, expected government expenditures, either quote the mandatory ones, Social Security and the medical entitlements, and then of course the defense budget, et cetera, the expected stream of expenditures looking to the next year. That again, there's going to be a budget deficit of anywhere between 1.3 and 1.5 trillion dollars. The year that just closed, the fiscal year had 1.4 trillion dollars, if I remember correctly. So as a consequence, they have to up it at least between $1.5 to $2 trillion to keep them a cushion leading into the next fiscal year. But I expect that they'll just try to kick the can down the road because neither party is willing to actually undertake the act that would really be like the stone that begins the avalanche down the mountain, with all of the side effects that will result from the admission that the system is long-term unsustainable. So, things do happen, but I'm expecting that they'll just cut some kind of a deal early in the year, or just before the real de facto deadline of the government not able to borrow anymore is being reached, and that they'll just kick it down the can, to kick the can down the road for another year at least, by raising it $1.5 to $2 trillion. And that just means that, what will that mean? Well, the national debt then will be closer to $34 trillion when that debt limit is reached. And interest rate charges on existing and rolled over debt will be even larger because interest rates are not going to fall next year. But I just expect them to kick the can down the road.
I totally agree. I mean, of course they're going to kick the can down the road. That's what they always do. Now, they could go one step further, which they sometimes do. They cause the government to be, quote, shut down. The non-essential functions. Of course, I've always said, well, if they're non-essential, why don't you shut them down permanently? But so they shut down these non-essential functions, and everybody's freaking out, except the Washington, D.C. bureaucrats. They're loving it because they get to stay at home on a little vacation. Because what the Republicans end up doing after this little hubbub is they end up agreeing that all these bureaucrats should get back pay. So the shutdown doesn't do any good at all. All those non-essential workers get fulfilled with a vacation. What's a paid vacation? That's what it is, which might be not a bad thing for from a libertarian standpoint because they're doing less harm sitting at home than over there in their offices. But here's another factor, Richard. The Republicans are famous for favoring a balanced budget amendment. You hear that often, oh, if you elect me, I'm going to support the balanced budget amendment. And what they're talking about is a constitutional amendment that would require a balanced budget. Now, never mind that if you have such an amendment, that what they're almost certain to do to balance the budget is just raise taxes instead of cut spending. But if they want a balanced budget amendment, which is what they say they want, isn't that what enforcing the debt ceiling is?
Yes, that's the very point. That's what in fact, one of the times when this issue came up a few years ago, I did a piece for FFF precisely on the fact that if you enforce a debt ceiling, it means the government can't borrow any more than the existing debt accumulated in the past, which means there can be no spending greater than what the government takes in taxes. You can't add to the debt for net increases in spending over taxation. So as a consequence, if they don't raise the debt ceiling, the U.S. government is de facto put on a balanced budget.
Right.
Which of course then they either have to raise taxes because they can't borrow anymore, or they have to cut spending. Neither of those are acceptable. They're certainly not cutting spending. All their special interest groups are going to whine and cry about that. But they can't easily raise taxes either, because then you see it hits people immediately and directly what the cost of everything the government does is taking out of their pockets.
Right. And so you're not going to have the Republicans enforcing it. And I say, well, why not? I mean, let's do a thought experiment, Richard. Let's say that the debt ceiling really is enforced, that the Republicans say, we're not going to cut a deal this time, that this is it. We're going to live within our means. This is like a balanced budget amendment, and we're not budging. All right, so what happens? Well, as you say, they could raise taxes. I don't think they would do that. So they would have to start slashing spending. And so all these non-essential functions of government, they just stay home. Those bureaucrats have to go out in the private sector after a certain point. They have to get jobs. Now, they may wait a while thinking, oh, this is going to be resolved, but let's do a thought experiment. Let's say it's not resolved. That means all those non-essential functions have to go out into the private sector and get real jobs. That's not a bad thing. You mentioned the Department of Education. We can go further. Department of Commerce, Department of Agriculture, Department of Labor. Just get rid of all that junk and lay off people and let them go out and get jobs in the private sector. Now you're talking about a real balanced budget. There's no more debt. You're just paying your expenses as you go, which is what a lot of families do. Why can't the government operate under that same principle?
For the simple reason is that they're in business to spend other people's money.
Yeah, well, that's what the whole welfare warfare state is all about.
See the benefit from their point of view of deficit spending is that you're able to offer goodies to your constituents and tell them that it's either for free or at a discounted price. You reelect me and I'm going to give you $1,000. And if you ask where the $1,000 is coming from, no problem. We're not going to raise your or anyone else's taxes. We're just going to borrow it, which means it's someone else's problem as a taxpayer and a citizen at some indefinite period in the future. Or I'm going to give you $1,000 worth of goodies, but I'm only going to increase your taxes by $300. Who doesn't want a bargain where you pay $300 for something that has a value to you of $1,000? Who doesn't take that offer? See, that's the game they play with deficit spending.
Oh, yeah. Well, the classic example of that was the stimulus checks. Oh, we're going to shut down all these businesses, but we're going to send you a free check. And we libertarians were saying, there ain't no free here. These things cost money. They're printing up the money. So they print up, I don't know what the stimulus checks were, $1 trillion or so, or something like that. And so all of a sudden people say, oh, you libertarians, we don't need to listen to you. This was free money. The government's our daddy. It can take care of us. No problem. Well, now look what's happening with the price of gasoline, the price of food, the price of cars, the price of everything. There's your price for your stimulus checks. It was never going to be free. And how could they not know this, Richard, that this was going to happen when they print up that much money while they're shutting down productive businesses that are reducing their tax revenues even more?
Because people choose to live, either they're ignorant, they just don't understand the economic logic of you can't consume unless you produce. And and given how much you produce, if you increase the money supply, all you do is increase the means by which people end up bidding up the prices of the scarce goods that they would like to purchase, or they're just deceptive. The politicians, I believe, look, they have staffs, Republicans and Democrats, and unless they're total ignoramuses living in a la-la land, a good part of them know that they're playing this magical little fantasy world game, but they don't care. It's just a matter to get through the next election cycle. The fact is, we just had an election. All the members of the House of Representatives and 1/3 of the Senate. And guess what? It's a couple of days after the election, and the 2024 campaign is already going on. Why? Because all the members of the House have to come up for election in 2 years. Another third of the Senate has to come up for election in 2 years, and the president is running for re-election, assuming he does. But someone's going to be interested in running for president, certainly a Republican. And as a result, they're already figuring out, well, how do I promise people other people's money so I can get reelected or into office for the first time? So the problem is their time horizon of how do we correct the problems? What needs to be done? What would make America both free and prosperous again? All those thoughts, even if they have them, are crammed into a time horizon of only 2 years. And they don't want to do anything that's going to rock the boat from their political advantage perspective.
Right. And it's important to emphasize what you did is that it's both parties that do this. But the party that's on the outside of power says, oh, look at Biden. He's caused inflation. He's caused this and he's caused that. When they were in power, they did the same thing. And that was when the Democrats said, oh, you need to put us in power, so we'll put things in order. It's just the same old crooked, corrupt racket that's been going on year after year, election cycle after election cycle. Let's not forget that the stimulus check started under Trump and the Republicans.
Yes.
So, I mean, they're both responsible, pox on both their houses, Richard. And really the real solution to this lies with the libertarian philosophy, which is what we're about here at FFF.
Yeah, the one thing to emphasize this about, the Republicans are no different, is that about halfway through Trump's term, the Times, the Washington Post ran stories that Trump had called a cabinet meeting and told all the cabinet members that they were to go back and figure out ways to cut their budget by 5%. Of course, nothing was done with it, but that's what they were told. And just for show, right? A responsible Republican administration. But then Trump was told, well, Mr. President, the major problems are the entitlement program, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. We're going to have to work out a plan to cut back those too. To which Trump was reported by the media, no, the people like those programs. I'm not going to cut those programs. Which means nothing got cut. And that's what spending and the debt grew during Trump's 4 years in office, just like before him with Obama and now with Biden.
Right, and it'll be the same as long as people keep putting their trust in these two parties. All right, on that note, Richard, we're out of time. We'll wrap things up here. Again, if you're new to FFF, come to fff.org for 33 years worth of articles. We've got a great online conference right now. Richard was our premier speaker. His talk is online at our website. It's called End Inflation and the Fed. It's talking about what we're talking about here. This coming Monday night, we have Ron Paul, or as he's known in the libertarian movement, the great Ron Paul. And he's the guy that popularized, remember, End the Fed, both on the left and the right, and of course in the libertarian movement. So it's going to be a great evening, and I want y'all to mark your calendars and join us. We got Q&A in there, and again, you'll be getting your end-of-year fundraising letter if you ever already gotten it by email. It's on our website. We would greatly appreciate your consideration. We can't do these kind of things without y'all's support and You've kept us going for 33 years, as I indicated earlier, and hope you'll help us keep going for another year of advancing the principal case for liberty. Thank you very much for tuning in, Richard. I greatly enjoyed the conversation as always, and I look forward to seeing you next week.
Until next time.